introduce Professor Sebastian ROCHÉ. Sebastian is a research professor at the National Centre of Scientific Research, based at Sciences Po at the University of Grenoble. My name is Professor Jenny Fleming from the University of Southampton. I'm the Professor of Criminology there and the Director of the Institute of Criminal Justice. Sebastian.
Hello, Jenny.
Perhaps you'd like to start by talking about your disciplinary background. You know, how did you get here to criminology?
Yes, that's a good idea.
That's a good idea.
I am a political scientist by training. I was educated in Sciences Po Political Science Institute in Grenoble in France. And then I was sent by my well-intentioned supervisor to do a postdoc at Oxford University at the Maison Française, which is an institution that is a link between France and in UK universities. And that's where I was almost immediately in relation with the international community. Not because I thought it was a good idea, but because my supervisor, Yves Chemay, thought it was a good idea. And of course, he had this global view, which wasn't very common at that time, because we are talking there about the 1980s. Mm. I submitted my PhD in 1991, so it's quite a long time ago. And then I went for a semester in Princeton, New Jersey, in the Center for French Studies, which is a part of the Center for European Studies, with Professor Ezra Suleiman, who is a political scientist, scientist specialized in French government. So my background is kind of public policies, political sociology, elections, etc. And I happened to do a PhD in France about fear of crime. That was the first time that there was a study on fear of crime. So we're talking about the mid of the 80s, like 1985. And the National Front became a prominent party at the beginning of the 80s. So the fear of crime and the rise of anti-immigration sentiment, the fear of insecurity, that was hot topics at that time. It was the beginning of it. Yes. And that's where I started my PhD. And so mostly as a sociologist of fear, looking at the determinants of fear of crime and the integration into local networks, isolated people versus people in large social networks in the countryside, in the cities, and also looking at the political dimension of fear, because people say that they are afraid because they want us to know that they are afraid. So there is the intention, and there is a political intention in disclosing your fear. So we shouldn't be, I think, naive and taking just the fear as something that exists in people independently of the political context. So that was my background. So I always was surrounded by political scientists and guided, like a tomato plant. There is a stick and you can develop your own fruits, but there is a direction. And even if you don't know, of course, I think disciplines matter, and they organize your thinking, etc., etc. So that's what that's my background. So yes.
So 30 years on, almost now, we're thinking, what would you sort of identify as your core research interests now?
Today, okay, so I have shifted over time. So I started with fear of crime, which is an exploration of, let's say, the feelings that people have and public opinion and perceptions. And then it took me to study incivilities and disorders. What could trigger the alarm in people and people's mind. Not necessarily violent crime, there are very few of them, and there is a very limited exposure to violent crime in continental Europe, even less than in the UK, if you take the crime victim statistics. But there are a lot of small things happening, and these small things contribute to fear, so that took me there. And then I was it was a drift towards the study of juvenile delinquency, because juveniles are more noisy, more lively also than older people. Took me to juvenile crime, and I started to use the ISRD kind of methodology on self-reported delinquency surveys.
Yes.
They hadn't been used in France in the 1990s, at the end of the 1990s when I did it. So I didn't reinvent it. I went to the international knowledge box, knowledge tools, and I used them in France, but I adapted them to the specificity, and namely the institutional behaviors, not only killing your wife or friends or assaulting somebody, but also targeting the officials, the police. So that was important in France. We had riots since the 1990s onward, which is a common point with the UK. So that was important. And then from there I moved to the responses, what to do, and that took me to the study of the judiciary and the police, and then I settled for the last 15 years in the study of police reforms, police systems, police agents' behavior, racial disparity in stops, these kinds of issue, and lately the things were rebadged in police legitimacy, police trust, but basically that's the same, that's police-citizen relations.
And that's your current research?
Yes, and that's for the last 15 years. I have mostly been doing studies about police reforms and perception of police and police agents' behaviors.
Okay. So when you look back on this career, and I remember first coming across your work myself in the 90s when you were doing public administration, political science reforms in police organisations. So when you sort of look back on that, what would you say were your big achievements? Not necessarily prizes or awards, but achievements in research.
Well, I would have to speak from a French perspective, because I think what I did was to act as a kind of bridge between France and the international community, because I was given that chance by my education, the fact that I was immediately sent abroad. Today postdocs abroad are very common in France, and the integration of the international literature is a very common thing for today's student. But in my times, if I may say so, it wasn't. So I was given that chance. So I think my achievement was when I studied fear of crime, I took the instruments that were invented by Canadian people, imported in France, and then I used them, like the network research was also much more advanced. For example, in California, there was a book dwelling, city dwellers, I don't remember the exact title. So I used this international methodology in France. And then same thing with the self-reported delinquency surveys. They were there, it was possible to use them, the questionnaires were there, available, etc., but they weren't used. So what I did, I took them and I had to fight in France just to prove that it was possible to use them. For example, I write to the National Institute of Security Research that belongs to the Ministry of Interior, and I tell them I would like funding to do this self-reported delinquency survey in France. And the answer is it might be possible in Belgium, it might be possible in the UK, certainly possible in Australia, but in France we don't see how it could be done. So it was a fight just to say that yes, we can do a crime victim survey, yeah, we can do self-reported crime and delinquency. That's one of my achievements in France. I think, and then if I think of the latest part of my career, it would be about police legitimacy, police trust. I started in a project with Mike Huff. He was in London at that time, to think about police trust and legitimacy in an international perspective, and I was the principal investigator for France. And again, I started to publish the findings in the media, in Le Monde, in the major weekly newspaper, on TV, etc., and saying, okay, look, we are not the best police in the world.
After all.
Yes, yes, and that was a shock because most people think we have the best everything in the world. And it's possible that we have some of the best food with the Italians, but in terms of policing, clearly we are in the third part of the league table. We are not the leaders, and we are sometimes not in the middle. We are very often at the top of the third of European countries. So we are closer to the bottom than to the top. So I started to do that and try to expose the leaders, parliamentary members, advisors to the ministers, locally elected people, with this message that we could do policing differently. And I'm not very successful in the sense that we haven't changed dramatically the police system, but I would still consider it an attempt and a contribution of science to do something good for society.
Okay, well, you almost have taken me to my next question, because my next question was going to be, what do you see as your greatest challenges? But in fact, that indeed was a challenge.
Yes, yes.
Do you identify any other challenges?
I would say there are two challenges. One is a more a scientific challenge. I think that the main challenge for me is to think in comparative terms, to think comparatively. If you think comparatively, you entirely change all the concepts, notions, and the interpretations. And I think we really need to build generalization on comparative surveys.
Yes.
If you look at only the determinants of trust in police in France, you don't understand the determinants of trust because you're in a specific context and you don't know. But when you put France into perspective in Europe, then you start to make a link between the political system, the accountability, local accountability of police, for example, and the satisfaction of the customers. So for me, this notion of doing comparative work is still a very important challenge because it's not so common. It exists. There are founders like David Bailey's and others, and then there are a couple of people in the world doing comparative policing research, but it's not a majority, clearly. So for me, that's really a challenge. Just one more example, with Dietrich Oberwittler in Germany, if you compare the integration of minorities, it's interesting. You see that in France, more people with a Maghrebian background feel French than people with a Turkish background in Germany. So you might say, in France, integration works better because there is a higher proportion of the migrants that feel French. But then what you see is that feeling French itself is a strong divide within the Maghrebian community, and it's not within the Turkish origin community in Germany, which means that there is a difference between the percentage of people that feel that they belong to a community and then the nature of the divide created by the feeling. And that you cannot see this if you only look at France or if you only look at Germany. But when you look at both, you see the two dimensions of the problem. And it's true for many other aspects. So for me, that's really a major challenge. And the other challenge is, of course, is reforming and contributing to a police and to policing practices which are more focused on quality. So quality policing would be for me a very important challenge. Not only numbers of arrests, numbers of stops, numbers, but the quality. It's like if you talk of a dentist, you would say a good dentist makes many holes in your teeth. No, he makes properly tools, holes in your teeth, and it doesn't make you feel pain. So it's not about the number of things you do, it's how you do them. And this quality of policing, for me, is really a frontier for a continental European policing.
Yes. Yes. We've talked about this before, actually, the difference in terms of the way French scholars think about criminology in France and the way that we might think about criminology in the UK or indeed in the States. Do you want to say something about that? Do you find when you come to these conferences that you are thinking differently?
Yeah, not really me, but I think it's a good opportunity to explain why there is no criminology in France.
Yes.
because we have founders of criminology, Gabriel Tard, Émile Durkheim. When they started to think about integration, they also thought about crime and criminality and propensity to crimes and what causes crime. So crime and integration were very much intertwined when sociology was founded at the end of the 19th century. But after the Second World War, we haven't made much progress in France, and the criminology was mostly considered something that belongs to the legal profession. So criminology was mostly the study of laws, not the study of sentencing, for example, that almost doesn't exist in France. Sentencing studies are very rare. The study of policing and stop and search has only 10 years of age, so it's very recent. So for a long time, there was no development in empirical criminology. There were the theories like Foucault, were major theoreticians, they talked about the grand enfermement, major locking up old people since the 18th century, which never existed, but still, so there was a French influence, major thinkers, but no empirical works. And then there was the foundation of the European Society of Criminology, and there Frenchmen participated, but some of them they were opposed to the foundation of criminology in France. They were members of the founders groups of the ESC, but they were opposed to the creation of criminology as a discipline in France. And that's mostly because of political issues. Criminology was led by non-academic persons very close to President Nicolas Sarkozy, who is a very right-wing political leader. So the institutional invention of criminology in France is seen as the creation of a right-wing president, Sarkozy, that established it and has promoted as professor of criminology an expert that didn't have even a PhD. So criminology was founded as a political thing with somebody that didn't have the minimum qualification that we require from our students to become assistant professors. Yes. So people were, all disciplines in France were disregarding criminology, saying this is not a scientific discipline, this is a political imposition on us. Therefore, it was rejected for domestic reasons, yes. And therefore, we don't have criminology, and there are no professors of criminology in France. You can teach criminology as a professor of law, professor of sociology, but there is no professor of criminology. There is no chair of criminology.
Okay, I don't think I knew that. Do you have then kind of ideas or opinions about criminology in the UK or other parts of Europe, but particularly in America? United States criminology, we think here in Europe, that is quite different. Do you have a view of that?
Well, the first impression is the intellectual domination of American universities, because they have among the finest universities in the world, and they are very wealthy, and they have very important thinkers and professors, and they have huge funding. And compared to what European funding for research was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, they had huge funding. When they did the Chicago project about crime and disorder that was conceived of by a group of people and later led by Rob Sampson, for example. We didn't have that money for criminology, it didn't exist. So they have both the very finest spirits and the money. Plus, they had the chance to have huge crime rates, which means they have a strong incentive. I mean, they have huge crime problems. Nothing in common with what we have in Europe, even today in terms of homicide per capita. So they have everything to build a very, very strong criminology. So that's a big difference. And France was more interested in theoretical assumption than in empirical verification. And in today's globalized world, that is not an asset for my country. If you don't contribute empirically, it's very unlikely that you are going to be heard on the international in the international arena. It's very unlikely. You need to substantiate your claims.
Yes.
And not everyone can be Michel Foucault. I mean, it's not possible. I mean, so that's really a big difference. The empirical foundation of science in the UK, for example, even evidence-based policing, etc. For me, it's an extension of this empirical foundation of science. And there is zero evidence-based policing in France. It doesn't exist even as a concept. The leaders, political leaders or police leaders, are not aware that there is such a thing as evidence-based policing, whether you like it or not. But it even doesn't exist as a subject of discussion. So that's the major difference, I would say, between several continental European countries and UK and the US that have a lead in terms of empirical research.
Can I throw in a little sort of question here that's not kind of thought about, but when you talk about empirical research, when I think about American criminology, I do think of it being quite quantitatively based, which is not necessarily the norm, certainly in the UK. Do you have a view of that? I mean,
I think so, but I wouldn't exclude qualitative research. For me, that's an empirical foundation as well. But it's true that for verification purposes, quantitative research has an edge. I mean, because for invention, I wouldn't say that quantitative research can find easily new ideas, because it's a very heavy weight kind of empirical work. But for verification, at some point you need to decide whether this factor has a weight of 2.8 or 6.8% of the variance, for example. So you need, I think, some quantification. But for the empirical qualitative work, there wouldn't be such a divide. We have a lot of small but not systematized qualitative works. Let me take the example of systematic social observations. In France, you have a lot of observation ethnography, but the notion that it can be systematic, for example, doesn't exist very much. Even people don't know the name systematic social observation. So this notion of increasing rigor, whether you do qualitative or quantitative, I think we are still at the back of the train. I think we've managed to climb and jump in the train. There are numbers of researchers today in France, not all of them here at the European Society, but they exist in terms of number of research projects. But we are not the leaders in the field, clearly.
Okay. Let me bring you back to the European Society, if I may. How do you see or perceive the role of the European Society of Criminology in criminology, in European criminology? What do you see as its role?
Okay, let me start with the foundation. So when it was founded, I think it's around the year 2000. So at that time, I didn't know that there was the foundation of the society, but a couple of people, they were thinking of establishing the society. And there was Michael Tonry, Martin Kilias, Josine Jongertas, and other people. And I was a participant in one of the first conference. And suddenly they all come into the workshop where I'm presenting. I have no idea why, and I see all these big shots coming from different countries, Switzerland, Netherlands, the US, the UK, and they sit and they listen to me. So I don't know, I'm a bit surprised. I mean, I have no idea why. And I think they were in the process of selecting the first Secretary General of the European Society. And I suppose Martin Kilias was the one, because he was speaking French, he was from Switzerland, so he knew some of my work. So I think he was the mediator into that. So he is the one who dragged me into...
Dragged you?
Yeah, because they came me and I was not proactive. I mean, they were the creators of this society. So they took me in, invited me in, if you wish. And for 3 years, I was the Secretary General. So you meet people, it's important, all the interpersonal links, etc., etc. So for me, the society was something important, because it created this community, and I was part of the creation of the community. I was aware, I would understand who is doing what, etc. But in terms of the national impact of the society, in France, it didn't have a major impact. It had an impact on selected people. Today, for example, Jacques de Maillard is a colleague in Paris. He's participant. He's there almost for every conference. So a number of people were attracted and now participate. But if I look at the entire country, there is a chronic underrepresentation of France into the society, because we are the largest country with Germany in terms of population, GDP, etc. But our contribution to the society is not a proportion of that of our influence, let's say, or size in Europe.
Or indeed the research.
Yeah. Yes. So that's a reality. So there is in France there is a mixed. I would make a mixed assessment of the success of the society. At European level, I think it's clearly a success.
Well,
it's established. It's established. It has working groups, policing working groups, self-reported delinquency working groups, other kind of crime against women working groups, etc. So it's a really established cooperation throughout Europe, and it has really assisted the development of a European criminology. But in France, it has, for the reason I mentioned, it has limitations.
Yes, shame really. Okay. What do you think are the future developments of criminology? And we won't confine that to France or to Europe, but the future developments. What are we looking at in the next 5 to 10 years, do you think?
I think we have, there is the challenge of integrating the big data. So what do? We have these classic surveys, people ticking boxes. Now they tick on the tablet or on the computer or with paper and pencil. Okay, we have this traditional thing. But what do we do with the big data? I think that's really important. The second issue, which is connected to that, is how do we study behaviors and not only opinions? I think if we are to be a stronger science, we have to study things that really exist. When you study the opinions of people, you have no idea whether this opinion exists in life, in the social life. We don't know. We don't know if we're not creating the object that we are studying, and to what extent we are creating it. Now, if you're a medical doctor, there is a disease, so you can count the number of patients, you can count the effect of the treatment, etc., etc. So I think that's a challenge that if we study, for example, legitimacy, we have to study obedience and rebellion. Not people ticking boxes, I like the police, I trust the police. We have to study, and we have to find ways to study the actual behaviors. For me, that's really a challenge. Working with the public authority is also a challenge. It's interesting, it has also drawbacks in terms of independence, but it has also positive aspects in terms of contribution to a society, because if we don't contribute to improving things, so what's the idea of science? I mean, if we don't turn science into something that affects people's life positively, it's very difficult to think positively of oneself and to also defend publicly the necessity of higher education. So for me, that's also a challenge for the future. And the last one being the integration of data at the EU level. And more integration of knowledge about police and crime. It has started, but this is an unfinished journey at the moment.
And the sharing of that knowledge.
Yes.
Across borders.
Exactly, yes. Production and sharing, so that we have, all scientists have access to larger databases that concerns all types of political units of the Union and beyond, if possible.
Agreed. Okay, well, we've known each other quite a long time, and I know about your work in Turkey, and I would think this would be of great interest. I'm thinking about how your work in Turkey has influenced the way you think about policing, about governance issues.
Yes. Yeah, it was for me a major influence. I think first influence was when I was educated for my postdoc in the UK. So I go to a university that has money, resources, the library is open, the people are nice to you when you want a book, etc. So it's contrary of the French system where we have guardians of books and not people servicing users. So that was the first shock. And the second shock is in Turkey. So I'm appointed as the chief technical advisor for a pre-accession of Turkey to the EU. So we are talking here of 2008, year 2008, which means that the EU is spending a large amount of money for countries to align themselves with norms and standards. So basically it's democratic norms and standards in the field of policing. And therefore, they have the money, you go there, you're selected, you go there, you are approved by the main beneficiary, the government of Turkey, and you establish a team of 10 to 60 people, depending on what moment of the project. And you have a 2.5 year project, and you have these millions of euros to spend, which is not common at the university. So you have to learn how to spend money, and that's quite a shock. And then the notion of the key idea is aligning Turkey with EU norms and principles, which don't really exist, in fact, but you have different examples in different countries. And then I was faced with the problem of finding the benchmarks and comparing the police systems. And immediately I was confronted with the problem that there is no portability of concept. You cannot transport the concept that we use in policing. So there was zero portability. If you're talking about even something which is not a concept, like the gendarmerie, the Turkish gendarmerie is an army fighting a domestic war and protecting border and doing policing. That doesn't exist in the rest of the world. The notion of independent oversight is not a notion which is understood. In Turkey, people were telling me, but how could anything be independent? They cannot be independent. They wouldn't believe that the notion of independence exists. The notion of oversight is an English word which doesn't exist in German, doesn't exist in French, doesn't exist in Turkish. So all the core notions that we use in the intellectual community do not exist in the legal systems and in the minds of the people working in a police system abroad. So that took me to the conclusion that there is a need for thinking of the concepts again and in a comparative perspective. So how to describe a police system? What are the notions that you need to describe a police system? And then I came up with the idea that there are 4 key notions, etc.
And what are those key notions?
Well, there is the distribution of powers, who is in charge, both in terms of constitution and then in terms of military government relations, because the constitution might give the security to the government, but it might be the case that the army has the upper hand on the government, or has they share the power with the government, which was the case in Turkey. And the second is the structure, the organization of the security system. Is it a big central organization? Is it 2 large central organizations? Is it a very fragmented system like in Switzerland or the UK? So that's the second pillar. The third pillar is the doctrines. What is the police doctrine? Not the police powers, but the doctrines. How would the police chiefs and their supervisor think of how they should do their jobs? So the police doctrines. And the final pillar would be the oversight mechanisms and principles, both internal oversight and external oversight and management tools. And for me, the combination of these 4 things, they might help to conceptualize policing and police systems in different countries.
And assist in creating those standards that you went over to look at.
Yes, because you need to decide, for example, if you need to align Turkey with the EU, okay, you want to look at the police doctrines, for example, but you have to find it, and many countries might not have one, for example. If you look at the oversight, they have dozens of oversight mechanisms. from internal discipline to external audit to parliamentary oversight teams, etc. You have dozens of things. So you need to identify all these mechanisms and to turn them into variables and to quantify them if possible. For example, you can create an institution that has no budget. If you create a defender of right, but he has no local representative and limited budget, you tick the box creation of the institution, but then it doesn't tell you what are the resources and what are the powers and what is the qualification of the staff, for example. So if you really want to compare, you need to go to that level of details.
And is that work in Turkey was what established your foundations for the comparative work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think so.
Have been doing since, really.
Yes, yeah. It gave me a sense of how important it is, and that there is nothing as intuitive as police or gendarmerie, that these notions are just illusions. Even the UK and the French police, I mean, they have nothing in common.
No.
Their accountability mechanisms are different, their targets are different, their staffing is different. The only common point is they have uniforms. And usually in democracies, these uniforms are blue because they don't want green, which is for the military.
Yes. Okay. Lastly, as we conclude, tell me where you think you'll be with your research or your work in 5 years' time.
That's a good question. Where I would like to be is to launch a large European, so that includes the UK, whether it's part of the EU or not. It's just European project about the comparison of the police systems, including the private and the public policing. Yes. The kind of mapping of Europe would be, for me, a very interesting, demanding, but also rewarding project. Yes, it would be an achievement. At the moment, we are not even able to describe what we think we are working on. If you're a pathologist, you know what the human body is, with for example, the organs, the different types of pathology, so you have something that you know exists. So for us, I think we still don't have this description of the object, and we haven't, and there is no agreement about what that is and what's the purpose of this object.
So we don't know what we don't know, really.
Yeah, at the moment, that might be the case.
Thank you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Jenny.